Good morning. I'm here to meet the vinyl community and the crime community. I'm going to read a chapter out of Nic Schreck's book, The Manson File. It's called Controlled Substances: How the Summer of Love Became the Summer of Blood. When the hacks get going on the Helter Skelter myth, there's one played to death riff they never tire of repeating. The murders on Cielo and Waverly Drive, they tell us, drove the last nail in the coffin of the peace and love era. And they piled on the simplistic cliches. Love-ins became hate-ins. Flowers were exchanged for knives. Scorpio killed Aquarius, blah, blah, blah. But forever we can buy what that was received idea, we have to accept an equally false notion that the Woodstock Nation ever really was the untroubled utopia of its champions' dreams. As we view the crimes of '69 within the proper context, it becomes clear that the bloom was already off Flower Power's rose 2 summers earlier. The slayings continually reported as singularly bizarre and inexplicable hippie anomalies, unprecedented in the history of crime, were no such thing. The Cielo Drive murder, the incident which, along with the Altamont Rock Festival, is most commonly forced into service in the spurious Death of the 60s scenario, was simply one of the many bloody skirmishes in an ongoing war between criminal cabals fighting for control over the hugely remunerative California dope market. For those who had eyes to see, the first warning signs of what was to come were already evident during the hippie movement's heyday. The Haight-Ashbury scenes, rapid dissolution, which Manson observed firsthand, was directly related to the underground struggle for psychedelic monopoly. In August of '67, the media hyped called The Summer of Love had already pre-sold Haight-Ashbury as hippie heaven. Gentle flower children were idolized as ethereal angels floating on flagrant clouds of pot. Back then, dope dealing was still considered by many to be more of a revolutionary act than a crime. In that heady atmosphere, pushers took on the trappings of medicine men, honored curiendos, carrying out a noble spiritual task for the free community. At least some of the tribe getting high and were still sincerely understood as a holy communion rather than a recreational activity. But the explosion of all those innocent Adam and Eves from paradise was near. The woman hidden in the corner of the counterculture, Eden's shiny apple, was already wriggling its head. That's because the dope trade, carrying to the endless sea of new arrivals to freakdom's ghetto, had become very big business. San Francisco's Democratic Party political machine had long been under mob control. In the power structure, the kind of money the only recently illegalized acid trade generated was a tempting target for organized crime. To expand the market, the mob added methamphetamine and heroin to the mix. A strangely based on sound business sense, an addicted customer is a repeat customer. Syndicate rules over the Haight's most profitable commerce was alarmingly swift. It triggered a long bad trip that went completely unreported in the dreamy puff pieces that first extolled flower power in the mainstream media before the same media changed its tune. But even without a mob, the dope dealing increasingly involved the exchange of ever larger sums of money. The cosmic love fest became a violent street battle. The communal counterculture ethos of brotherhood was not matched for the ruthless laissez-faire capitalism of crime which government outline of psychedelics empowered. In the fate of ever more rip-offs and burned, supposedly Pacific flower children who survived by selling dope and the hate, adding knives and guns to the usual regalia. Manson was later made a scapegoat for the phenomenon which began before he ever stepped foot into the hate, but which had gone unnoticed by the media during its hippie honeymoon. Washington Post reporter Nicholas von Hoffman was an astute witness of the Haight-Ashbury insurrection. He was one of the first to decry the establishment's media narrative reportage of the hippie phenomenon and its so-called co-opting and defanging of the whatever real revolution potential may have existed. Early in 68, von Hoffman observed, many writers lost their judgment most entirely. They projected absurd hopes into the young and then converted these hopes into facts. The mass media rhapsodies were harmless excursions. The fact that the establishment organs printed so many miles of anti-established invective was testimony to their true nature, innocent entertainment. More directly relevant to the neglect hippie crime wave the drug trade had unleashed, von Hoffman noted it made no difference that these flower children were armed, and not for revolution, or even that. In terms of old-fashioned police reportage, the reporters were pressing up the criminal aspect of the biggest crime in the story since Prohibition. And Martin E. Lee and Bruce Shanlin described the mood of the quickly changing times in their acid dreams. With each passing week, things got a little heavier, a little freakier in the hate. A clincher came when a couple of independent drug dealers were murdered a few days apart. One had his arm cut off, the other was butchered and thrown off a cliff. The hippies were quick to blame the mob, but nobody knew what had actually happened. Double-crossing, snitching, burns, and disappearance were endemic to the dope industry, and the number of people had private scores to settle. There was also a lot of friction between white street kids and black in the neighboring Fillmore district. For a while, it seems like everyone was packing heat, a blade for the heavy caliber weapon. Yeah, I made the Fillmore stage with Jerry Garcia, and I was strapped up to join the band, and Grace Slick threw me off the stage. She was a federal agent, and that's not allegedly, folks. For a while, it seemed like everyone was packing heat, a blade or a heavy caliber weapon, as Haight-Ashbury degenerated into survival for the fittest trip. The brutal slayings of the two prominent hate pushers, John Kent Carter and William E. Thomas, barely noted a mention of all the idealistic peace and love hot air incense being blown by the press. But in fact, these crimes, rather than the Tate LaBianca murders, 2 years later, were the first of the hippie killings, which is to say that they were the first notable casualties of the drug wars to come. Although on a smaller scale, the executions of Carter and Thomas inspired the same kind of rumors that set the same chills of paranoia up and down the spines of the inner circle of psychedelic scenesters and the Cielo Drive murders would cause in '69. The hits on Carter and Thomas's provided ample warning that the love generation wasn't quite as lovey-dovey as they were made out to be. They left no doubt that the dope trade at the center of the youth revolution was as much more dangerous proposition than had been presumed. One underground acid chemist's reaction to the 67 dope dealer deaths summed up the rapidly deteriorating situation. Listen, 3/4 of the kids out in the street would kill you for $2 if they got you alone and they had a weapon. Love generation, what crap. On the streets, they were piled with profitable trade. John Kent Carter, 25, also known as Chobe, and William E. Thompson, 26, was called Super Spade. I guess if you're named Super Spade, you must be black. Just as the murders of drug dealers Gary Hinman, Sebring, and Fatowski would make headlines in August of '69, the first of a long line of hippie drug murders occurred within days of each other in August of '67. In August 3rd, 67, when most of the Chobe's mutilated bodies was found in his bloody psychedelic pad, words on the grapevine was that the dealer's right arm had been chopped off as a symbolic comeuppance for a burn he carried out with his right hand. The killer also took nearly $3,000 in cash from his victims who had been stabbed in his heart. The cops eventually found Chobe's presumed executioner driving around in a dead man's car. They also found the severed arm sewn up inside the velvet bag. The rumor mill has it that the mob had removed Chobe from commission, but pressing coverage painted the killing as a result of a fatal acid freakout. When the killer, one Eric Dolstrom, was apprehended, he admitted that he suspected Carter and cheated him on a quality of his most recent purchase, some bad acid, the exact same motive that inspired the killing of Gary Hinman. Sebring and Fatowsky 2 years later, Carter's murder is quite similar to Hinman's, even down to the killer getting busted while driving his victim's blood-stained car. Super Spade, as William E. Thomas was known to the freaks he sold drugs to, wanted out from the dangerous business of dealing. He'd once managed the folk trio Peter, Paul, and Mary. We all know who that is. Their manager was Super Spade. And he thought once he could make it straight world again, he planned to make one of those big acid scores, then retire with the cash earned to open a restaurant in Marin County. On August 6, 67, Super Spade's corpse was discovered dangling from a cliff in a sleeping bag on Point Reyes. He'd been stabbed in his heart, and there was a single bullet in the back of his head, the mob's traditional calling card. Shortly thereafter, real panic broke out in the Haight. It was rumored that as much as $50,000 in drug profits were stolen from him when he showed up to make a big score from the Sausalito lab. Intriguingly, in 69, Colonel Paul Tate investigated the possibility that his near son-in-law, Sebring, had been manufacturing acid on a boat docked in the Sausalito marina. Wearing a button proclaimed him as Super Spade, faster than a speeding mind. Thomas was the Haight's token soul brother. He'd been one of the few black dealers who actually mingled with the flower children and who was accepted by them as one of their own. Manson's purported racism is usually singled out as an anomaly among the hippies, but there's never been any love lost between the almost exclusively white hippies in the Haight and the blacks in the neighborhood Fillmore district. The interracial tension, ignored in politically correct histories of hippiedom, was a stress factor in the Haight's social structure long before Manson made the scene. Relations between the two subcultures, united only by their use of drugs, their mutual antagonism against the police, and their proximity to each other, were always hostile. The prevailing paranoid attitude and the typical reaction to Super Spade's death was offered at a time by a hippie chick identified as Peggy, proprietor of the Haight Boutique, who said, "You know how I feel about spades? They come in here and they steal the leather jackets. They won't steal anything inexpensive. But Super Spade was different. He was a real beautiful person. But I know somebody else who's going to get killed. Shh, let me tell you, Roman's missing. He's a good friend of ours, and I'm sure some speed freaks found him and killed him, and maybe it's the mafia. Don't you think the mafia killed Super Spade? What else do you do?" Super Spade's violent passage even inspired the same kind of metaphysical speculation that Sharon Tate's death would later arouse. A self-described Haight warlock named Augie, an inaugurated boo-hoo of the Neo-American Church, bragged of his ESP powers. "I told 3 people that the Spade car was going to be killed." Everyone in the Haight knew Super Spade. Fellow dealer Charles the Gardener Manson was no exception. Manson described his own encounter with Super Spade in the Blackle White Bus, which you will find appended in the Wizard chapter of this book. There Manson refers to the big black bald guy sitting on the pillows and smoking a pipe on that tale of O.M. Another of Super Spade's street names. One discrepancy, Thomas was known for sporting an afro because they became popular, so Manson's description of him as bald is puzzling. To say the least, the narrative makes it clear that the two dealers weren't the best of terms. When the Times financier Ed Sanders attended Manson's trial in 1970, he claimed that Manson sent him a note which he interpreted as an admission of involvement in Super Spade's death. According to Sanders, the note read, Super Spade dismembered by the Kings of Hearts. But Super Spade wasn't dismembered, and his death suggested a classic gangland style execution. So it's unlikely that that's what Manson was referring to in the Black White Bus. Manson describes cutting Super Spade's ear during a knife duel. This may be what he meant by dismemberment. In any event, the Super Spade incident provides us with Manson's first known near-fatal fight with a rival black dealer and his first near severance of another drug dealer's ear. Yeah, I wonder how Nick lost his ear. An odd-coming attraction of the Bernard Crowe and Gary Hinman episodes 2 years later. What mainstream accounts of these crimes have so significantly failed to mention Manson's own self-incrimination in the bloodletting, ear-slashing encounter with the rival dope dealer in the early 67s? If a mystery to me. Should you care to see Super Spade in action and all his hippie hate hustle, the trippy 68 Time documentary, You Are What You Eat, is a time capsule featuring the zany zeitgeist well. The film, the brainchild of musician Peter Yarrow, Peter, Paul, and Mary, was financed by Michael Butler, the producer of Hair. Remember the Hair where everyone took off their clothes? That was produced by Michael Butler, and who later learned of John Phillips' encounter with the slain Cielo victims on the night of his deaths. It also features Charles Hogg Farm admirer Tiny Tim. Released after Super Spade's murder, the flick in the testament to just how small the perilous world of psychedelic sales and slaughter really were in the first few years of the Flower Child blossoming. That's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is called Jailbirds of a Feather Flock Together. We want to thank the vinyl community. I did a short yesterday, which got more views. I just played a bootleg record, and they let it go. So God bless the vinyl community and the crime community and all the families and children, and we pray for peace again.